In a world that never seems to slow down, there's something profoundly peaceful about retreating to places that exist beyond the reach of deadlines and notifications. Tonight, we're going somewhere even better than that, to lands where magic is real, and every sunset promises a new adventure. High above a world consumed by shadow, where the clouds themselves serve as guardians against the darkness below, floats a sanctuary born of desperation and divine love. Skyloft hangs suspended in the endless blue, a cluster of islands that drift serenely through the heavens, home to the last remnants of humanity. But this peaceful, floating paradise was not always their home. It was their refuge, created in the darkest hour when the surface world fell to demons and death. Long before the floating islands knew the sound of human voices, the surface below was a realm of green forests and crystal rivers, where people lived in harmony with the goddess Hylia herself. The divine light that flowed through all things was protected by her grace, a power so pure and radiant that it could illuminate even the deepest darkness. Yet from the very depths of the earth came something that sought to devour that light, the Demon King and his endless army of shadow. The invasion was swift and merciless. Ancient forests that had stood for millennia were reduced to ash in a single night. Rivers that had run clear for countless generations turned crimson with blood. Monuments carved by loving hands crumbled to dust beneath demonic claws. The very air grew thick with malice as the demon army swept across the land like a plague of destruction, seeking the divine power that Hylia protected. In those final, desperate moments, as the last sanctuaries fell and hope seemed to flicker like a dying flame, the goddess made a choice that would echo through eternity. Rather than watch her people perish, she gathered them with her divine power. Every child, every elder, every soul who still drew breath, and lifted them beyond the reach of shadow. The great chunk of earth they called home was torn from the surface and carried into the heavens, beyond the clouds, beyond the reach of demonic wings. Thus was Skyloft born, not in triumph, but in sorrow, not as a conquest, but as an act of love so profound it reshaped the very heavens. The goddess took her sacred power, the Triforce itself, and carried it with her people to their new home among the clouds. There, suspended between earth and stars, humanity would learn to live again. But even as she created this sanctuary, Hylia knew her work was not finished. Leaving her people safe in their sky-bound refuge, she returned to the surface to stand with those who still fought below, the Gorons of the mountains, the fish-like Zora of the rivers, the forest spirits, and all who refused to yield to darkness. The war that followed was long and terrible, but eventually peace was restored to the surface, though at a cost that would be felt for generations. In their floating home, the people learned to live as the goddess intended, in harmony with the sky itself. They discovered the great birds called loftwings, majestic creatures with hearts as noble as their wingspans were vast. These weren't mere mounts, but companions, each bonded to a human soul in a partnership that transcended simple necessity. Together, rider and bird became one with the endless blue, soaring between the scattered islands that made up their aerial kingdom. The culture that emerged in Skyloft was unlike anything the surface had ever known. The Knight Academy became the heart of their society, where young men and women learned not just the arts of combat, but the deeper meaning of protection and service. Here, beneath Gothic arches that reached toward the infinite sky, students practiced with wooden swords, while their loft wings waited patiently outside, knowing that soon they would take to the air together. The wing ceremony became their most sacred tradition, an annual celebration where the finest student knights competed in aerial trials that tested not just skill, but character. The winner would be honored to reenact the ancient legend, to play the role of the legendary hero who would one day save the world, paired with a young woman representing the goddess herself. It was beautiful irony that in the year our story begins, the ceremony would be won by Link, a young man who had no idea he was not playing a role, but preparing for his destiny, partnered with Zelda, who was not merely representing the goddess, but was her mortal form, sleeping within a human heart. At the center of Skyloft stood its greatest wonder, the massive goddess statue, a monument so large it dwarfed even the grandest buildings. This was no mere sculpture, but a holy relic, carved with divine purpose and imbued with sacred power. Within its stone depths lay secrets that would remain hidden until the hour of greatest need, chambers where the goddess sword waited in eternal slumber, ready to be awakened by worthy hands and transformed through trials of fire and faith into something greater. The people of Skyloft lived their days in peaceful routine, never knowing they walked daily past the place where the master sword would be born. They shopped in the markets beneath the statue's shadow. Children played in courtyards blessed by its presence, and lovers met by moonlight while the ancient stone kept its vigil. The bazaar rang with cheerful voices as merchants sold their wares, while overhead, Beetle's strange airship drifted in lazy circles, its proprietor calling out his distinctive greeting to anyone who would listen. Life in Skyloft moved with the rhythm of the winds and the cycle of the sun. Mornings brought the sound of loft wings calling to their riders, while evenings were filled with the gentle music of daily life, conversations over dinner, children's laughter echoing from the academy halls, the soft rustle of wind through the floating gardens that dotted the islands. It was a life unmarked by the urgent drumbeat of war or the constant shadow of danger. Yet beneath this tranquil surface lay depths of mystery that few suspected. The light tower stood ready to pierce the eternal storm that surrounded the thunderhead, waiting for the day when someone would play the ballad of the goddess and open a path to secrets hidden in tempest and cloud. Ancient mechanisms slumbered within the statue itself, ready to respond to sacred songs that had not been heard for generations. Most poignant of all was the truth that Skyloft's very existence was a testament to sacrifice, not just the goddess's sacrifice in creating it, but the ongoing sacrifice of separation. For generations, the people of the sky had lived apart from the world below, protected but also isolated, safe but also incomplete. They had become something new and wonderful, but in doing so, they had lost something as well, their connection to the earth that had given them birth. The irony was beautiful and heartbreaking. The very salvation that preserved humanity also separated them from their true home. They lived in paradise, but it was a paradise built on exile. They soared through endless skies, but the ground beneath the clouds called to something deep in their souls that they could not name. In saving her people, the goddess had also given them a longing they could not fully understand, a pull toward something they had never known, but somehow remembered. And so Skyloft floated on, serene and beautiful, a sanctuary where humanity learned to live among the clouds while dreaming, however dimly, of the day they might return to the earth below. It was a place of peace built from chaos, of hope rising from despair, of love so profound it could lift entire civilizations into the sky and hold them there until the time came to set them gently down again. In the gentle sway of the floating islands, in the cry of loft wings on the wind, in the quiet prayers offered at the goddess statue, Skyloft held its vigil, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, love finds a way to shelter what matters most, lifting it beyond the reach of shadow and cradling it safely until the dawn comes again. Through ages and timelines, across the shifting currents of possibility and fate, one structure has remained constant: the seat of power, the crown jewel of every Hyrule that has ever been or ever will be. Hyrule Castle stands not merely as a building of stone and mortar, but as an idea given form, a symbol of hope and authority that transcends the boundaries between worlds. Yet each iteration tells its own story, shaped by the hands that built it and the hearts that called it home. In the era when time itself could be traversed with the pull of a sacred blade, when a young hero first learned that destiny could be both gift and burden, Hyrule Castle rose in pristine white stone against the azure sky. Its towers reached toward heaven with Gothic elegance, while blue tiled roofs caught the sunlight and scattered it like scattered jewels across the surrounding fields. This was a castle built in an age of relative peace, when the greatest concerns were matters of diplomacy and trade, when the throne room echoed with discussions of policy rather than the clash of steel. The approach to this magnificent structure spoke of a kingdom confident in its security, yet wise enough to maintain proper defenses. A broad moat encircled the castle grounds, its clear waters reflecting the white walls like a mirror made of sky. The drawbridge that spanned this barrier was a masterwork of engineering, heavy enough to withstand any assault, yet graceful in its construction. Beyond this lay the outer courtyard, where guards in polished mail walked their appointed rounds, while merchants and diplomats went about their daily business. But it was within the castle's heart that the most significant moments unfolded, not in grand throne rooms or council chambers, but in a simple courtyard where a young princess named Zelda kept her private garden. Here, among roses and fountain streams, Princess Zelda would steal precious moments away from the rigid protocols of court life. The courtyard was her sanctuary, a place where she could tend her flowers and think thoughts that had nothing to do with statecraft or ceremony. It was here, in this peaceful space, that she first encountered the forest boy, who would change the course of history. Link had come seeking an audience with the princess, guided by strange dreams and the words of a dying tree. He found her in her garden, tending her beloved flowers, while sunlight played across her golden hair. Their meeting was brief but profound, two children sharing secrets while the weight of prophecy gathered around them like storm clouds on a distant horizon. From her courtyard, Princess Zelda could peer through the great windows into the throne room where her father conducted the affairs of state. It was through those same windows that she and Link witnessed a scene that would haunt both their dreams. The tall figure of Ganondorf, king of the Gerudo, bowing low before the Hylian throne and pledging his eternal loyalty to the crown. To the king of Hyrule, this seemed the culmination of long diplomatic efforts, the final piece in unifying all the scattered tribes under one peaceful banner. The throne room where this scene unfolded was itself a masterpiece of royal architecture. Soaring columns supported a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes from Hyrule's golden age, while stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across the polished marble floor. The throne itself was carved from a single block of white stone, its high back adorned with the royal crest and flanked by banners bearing the symbols of the three golden goddesses. This was a room designed to inspire awe and respect, to remind all who entered of the divine authority that flowed through the royal bloodline. Yet, in that moment of apparent triumph, evil wore the mask of diplomacy. Ganondorf's words were honeyed, his manner respectful, his gestures perfectly calculated to put the court at ease. He spoke of unity and prosperity, of the wisdom of the Hylian crown, and the honor of serving under its banner. But his eyes told a different story, eyes that burned with ambition and hunger, eyes that measured every weakness and catalogued every strength. And in one chilling moment, as if sensing the watching children, he turned his gaze toward the window where Link and Zelda huddled in terrified silence. The false allegiance sworn in that throne room would prove to be one of the most catastrophic deceptions in Hyrule's history. For while the king celebrated what he believed to be a diplomatic victory, Ganondorf was already planning his true purpose, to use his newfound access to the castle and the trust of the royal family to position himself for the moment when the legendary hero would open the way to the sacred realm. Every bow, every respectful word, every gesture of loyalty was part of a web being woven around the very heart of the kingdom. The tragedy unfolded with the precision of a master strategist's gambit. When Link completed his trials and gathered the three spiritual stones, when he stood before the door of time and drew the master sword from its pedestal, he unknowingly provided Ganondorf with the opening the evil king had waited for. As the blade sealed Link away for 7 long years, Ganondorf slipped into the sacred realm like a shadow following light, claiming the Triforce, and transforming from ambitious king to dark lord of unimaginable power. The white castle that had stood as a symbol of peace and prosperity became something else entirely under Ganondorf's rule. The pristine walls grew dark with malice, while the gardens withered under the weight of corrupted power. The throne room, where diplomatic ceremonies had once been held, became a chamber of shadows, where the usurper king plotted the complete domination of Hyrule. Castletown, once a bustling center of commerce and culture, fell into decay as its citizens fled, or fell victim to the monsters that now roamed freely through streets that had once known only laughter and trade. Yet this transformation was itself temporary, for castles, like kingdoms, rise and fall in cycles, as eternal as the seasons themselves. In another age, in another timeline where twilight could bleed through the barriers between worlds, Hyrule Castle took on a different form entirely. Here, Gothic spires reached even higher toward storm-darkened skies, while flying buttresses and pointed arches spoke of an architecture influenced by darker aesthetic sensibilities. This castle knew invasion not through deception, but through overwhelming force. When the Twilight King Zant arrived with his army of shadow beasts, there was no pretense of diplomacy, no false words of alliance. The attack was swift and brutal, a demonstration of power that left no room for negotiation. Princess Zelda, descendant of queens and heir to ancient wisdom, found herself pinned back to her own throne room with only her most loyal knights between her and conquest. The throne room where she made her final stand was vast and solemn, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadow, while stained glass windows cast fractured light across stone floors, worn smooth by generations of royal processions. Here, surrounded by the symbols of her authority and the memories of her ancestors, Zelda faced an impossible choice. She could fight and watch her people die in a war they could not win, or she could surrender her kingdom to preserve their lives. The decision she made in that moment, to kneel before the invader and yield her crown, was perhaps the most heroic act any ruler had ever performed. It was not the heroism of the battlefield or the glory of victory, but the quiet heroism of sacrifice, the courage to bear shame and defeat so that others might live. In surrendering, she saved countless lives while accepting a burden that would have crushed a lesser soul. The prison tower where Zelda was kept after her surrender became its own kind of throne room, a place where true authority revealed itself not through crowns and scepters, but through dignity maintained in the face of defeat. Her chamber, high in the eastern tower, was elegant despite its purpose, with a fireplace that cast warm light across tasteful furnishings and windows that looked out over the kingdom she could no longer protect. Here she waited, not in despair, but in patient preparation for the moment when hope would return. That same castle would later open its doors to reveal wonders and horrors in equal measure. The hero who came to challenge Ganondorf would explore chambers that had never before been shown to outsiders, vast halls where Darknuts prowled in eternal vigilance, treasure rooms where the accumulated wealth of ages gathered dust, and secret passages that spoke of histories older than memory. The very stones seemed to whisper of the countless dramas that had unfolded within these walls across the centuries. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation came in an age when calamity fell from the sky, like divine judgment gone wrong. Here, Hyrule Castle became both sanctuary and battleground, refuge and trap, symbol of hope and monument to tragedy. This iteration rose even grander than its predecessors, a massive structure that dominated the landscape for miles in every direction, its multiple levels and countless chambers creating a vertical city within the greater kingdom. The castle that Princess Zelda knew in her youth was a place of learning and wonder, where ancient knowledge was preserved in vast libraries, and where the accumulated wisdom of ages was studied by scholars from across the realm. The dining hall could seat hundreds, while the guard chambers housed the finest knights in the kingdom. The observatory at the castle's peak allowed the royal astronomer to chart the movements of stars and predict the subtle changes that might herald the return of ancient evils. Yet it was in Princess Zelda's private study that perhaps the most important work was done. Here, surrounded by books and artifacts that chronicled the long struggle between light and darkness, she labored to unlock the sealing power that flowed in her bloodline. Night after night, she pored over ancient texts and practiced the prayers her ancestors had used to commune with the goddess. The weight of expectation pressed down upon her like the stones of the castle itself. She was the heir not just to a throne, but to a power that might save or damn them all. When the calamity finally struck, the castle became the stage for the final act of a tragedy, 100 years in the making. The very guardians and divine beasts that had been excavated to protect the kingdom turned against their creators, their ancient programming corrupted by the malice of Ganon. The halls that had echoed with scholarly debate now rang with the sounds of battle, as knights fought desperately against enemies they had thought to be allies. The throne room witnessed Princess Zelda's greatest moment of triumph and despair. Here, as Calamity Ganon manifested in all its terrible glory, she finally felt the sealing power awaken within her. But the victory came at the cost of everything she held dear. Her kingdom lay in ruins. Her knight lay dying in the fields beyond, and she faced the prospect of an eternal vigil, holding back the darkness through will alone. For 100 years, she maintained that vigil from within the castle's highest chambers. Her consciousness merged with forces beyond mortal comprehension, while her body remained suspended in time. The castle itself became a kind of shrine during those lost decades, its corridors haunted by the ghosts of better times, while guardians patrolled its perimeters like mechanical mourners keeping watch over a tomb. The restoration of the castle came not through reconstruction, but through liberation. When Link finally faced Ganon in the sanctum where Zelda had made her stand, the battle that ensued was more than physical combat. It was a spiritual cleansing that swept away a century of accumulated malice and pain. The beams of divine light that struck the castle from the 4 divine beasts were like healing rays, washing away the corruption that had infected every stone. Yet even this was not the end of the castle's story, for deeper beneath its foundations lay secrets that connected it to the very beginning of Hyrule's tale. The recent upheaval had revealed the truth that few suspected. The castle had been built not merely as a seat of government, but as a seal, its foundations deliberately placed over the prison where an ancient evil had been bound by powers that predated the kingdom itself. The revelation that Ganondorf had been sleeping directly beneath the royal seat for millennia cast every previous triumph and tragedy in a new light. Every feast celebrated in the Great Hall, every treaty signed in the throne room, every child born within the castle walls had taken place directly above the source of Hyrule's recurring nightmare. The castle's entire history became a testament to the terrible irony of fate, that salvation and damnation could exist in such close proximity, separated only by stone and prayer and the vigilance of those who chose to stand guard against the darkness. Through all its incarnations, across all timelines and possibilities, Hyrule Castle remained what it had always been. Not just a building, but an idea made manifest. It stood for the belief that order could triumph over chaos, that justice could prevail over power, that hope could endure even in the darkest hour. Every stone in its walls was placed with intention. Every banner that flew from its towers carried the weight of accumulated faith. The castle's true strength was never in its walls or weapons, but in the hearts of those who called it home. Whether it was a young princess tending her garden while the fate of the world hung in the balance, or a defeated queen maintaining her dignity in a tower cell, or a scholar working through the night to unlock the mysteries of divine power, the castle drew its meaning from the courage of those within its walls. In the end, Hyrule Castle stands as perhaps the most perfect symbol in all the legends, a reminder that power without purpose is merely tyranny, that true authority comes not from the ability to command, but from the willingness to serve, and that the greatest victories are often won not through conquest, but through sacrifice. The castle endures because the values it represents are eternal, carved not just in stone, but in the human heart itself. In the heart of every timeline stands a forest that remembers everything, every footstep that has crossed its threshold, every secret whispered beneath its canopy, every soul that has sought shelter in its depths. The Lost Woods exists beyond the ordinary boundaries of space and time, a living maze that protects what lies at its center through misdirection and mystery. Those who enter without permission find themselves turned around, again and again, emerging exactly where they began, as if the forest itself gently but firmly refuses their passage. Yet for those who belong, for those who understand the rhythm of ancient magic that flows through root and branch, the woods part like curtains before a stage. The trees themselves seem to lean inward, creating corridors of green twilight where shafts of golden sunlight pierce the canopy in precise, almost deliberate patterns. This is not mere woodland, but a sanctuary older than kingdoms, a place where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of spirits grows thin as morning mist. At the heart of this eternal maze stands the great Deku Tree, a being so ancient that he has watched civilizations rise and fall like seasons passing. His massive trunk stretches toward the sky with the patience of centuries, while his roots delve deep into the earth's mysteries. He is more than a tree. He is wisdom given form, compassion made manifest in bark and leaf. His voice carries the weight of ages when he speaks, yet it holds the gentle warmth of a grandfather telling bedtime stories to beloved children. In the era when time could be commanded by sacred melodies, when a young hero first learned that courage sometimes meant leaving everything familiar behind, the Lost Woods cradled a village unlike any other in the world. Kokiri Forest was a place where childhood never ended, where the innocence of youth was preserved like flowers, pressed between the pages of an ancient book. The houses were grown rather than built, living trees shaped by gentle magic into cozy homes, with doors just the right size for small hands to open. The Kokiri children who lived here possessed an ageless quality that spoke of magic woven into their very beings. They appeared to be perhaps 10 or 12 years old, with bright eyes full of wonder and hearts unmarked by the sorrows that typically come with the passage of time. Each was accompanied by a fairy companion, tiny beings of light that danced around their partners like living stars, sharing in their joys and offering comfort in moments of uncertainty. Among these eternal children lived one who was different, though he did not yet understand why. Link appeared to be Kokiri like the rest, yet he alone had no fairy companion. The other children sometimes whispered about this oddity, though never with malice, merely the casual curiosity of youth trying to understand something beyond their experience. He felt the absence keenly, like a melody missing its final note, a question that had no answer. The truth of his presence in the forest was a story of love and sacrifice that began in the chaos of war. When the Hyrulean civil war raged across the land, bringing death and destruction to places that had known only peace, a young Hylian mother found herself fleeing through the wilderness with her infant son. Behind her lay everything she had ever known, now consumed by flames and violence. Ahead lay only uncertainty and the desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, she might find safety for the child she carried. Her flight led her deeper into the mysterious woods than any outsider had ever ventured. Perhaps it was desperation that guided her steps, or perhaps it was fate itself that brought her at last to the grove where the great Deku tree kept his eternal vigil. There, beneath branches that had sheltered countless generations, she made the most difficult decision any parent could face. She chose love over possession, her child's future over her own happiness. The great Deku tree, ancient beyond measure and wise beyond mortal understanding, looked upon the dying mother and her innocent child with eyes that had witnessed the full scope of joy and sorrow that life could offer. He understood immediately what was being asked of him, and more importantly, he recognized the threads of destiny that were already beginning to weave themselves around the baby's future. This was no ordinary child. This was one who would be called upon to bear burdens that would have crushed grown men, to make choices that would echo through generations. With infinite gentleness, the guardian spirit accepted the sacred trust placed in his care. He watched over the child as the mother drew her final breath beneath his protective boughs, and he whispered promises to her fading spirit that her son would be loved, would be protected, would be prepared for the great work that lay ahead. The forest itself seemed to embrace the child, welcoming him into a community that existed outside the normal flow of time and change. Years passed in the timeless way of the Kokiri village, where seasons meant little, and the concerns of the outside world were held at bay by the protective enchantments of the woods. Link grew up believing himself to be like the other children, though questions lingered at the edges of his consciousness, like half-remembered dreams. Why was he taller than the others? Why did he sometimes dream of places beyond the forest? Why did the call of adventure stir something deep in his heart when the other Kokiri were content to remain in their eternal playground? The answer came when the great Deku tree finally called him to his destiny. As Link stood before the ancient guardian, feeling small beneath branches that seemed to support the very sky, he learned for the first time about the world beyond the forest, a world in danger, a world that needed someone brave enough to leave safety behind and venture into uncertainty. The fairy Navi, a being of pure light and ancient wisdom, became his companion at last, marking the beginning of his true journey. But the forest's story did not end with Link's departure. Indeed, in some ways it was just beginning, for the Lost Woods exists in all timelines, all possibilities, adapting and changing while remaining fundamentally itself. In the timeline where the waters rose to cover the land, where the old world was washed away beneath an ocean of divine judgment, the forest underwent a transformation as miraculous as it was necessary. The Kokiri children, faced with a world completely changed, discovered within themselves a capacity for adaptation that spoke to the deep magic that had always flowed through their beings. They became the Koroks, small plant-like creatures who retained the essential innocence and joy of their former selves while gaining the ability to thrive in a world remade by flood and wind. Their faces, carved from wood and leaves, bore expressions of perpetual wonder, as if they had learned to find beauty in every moment, regardless of circumstances. The great Deku tree, too, transformed to meet the needs of this new age. The ancient spirit took root within the hollow trunk of his predecessor, smaller in stature but no less wise, no less loving in his care for the forest children. Around him, The forest haven blossomed into a paradise of green, growth, and flowing water, a place where life could flourish even in a world transformed by catastrophe. The Koroks' mission became one of renewal and hope. They scattered across the great sea, planting seeds on islands that had never known forests, bringing life to barren rocks and abandoned shores. Their work was done without fanfare or recognition, simply because it needed to be done, because life itself was sacred and worthy of protection. In this way, the forest's influence spread far beyond its traditional boundaries, carried by small hands to every corner of the flooded world. Yet perhaps the most poignant chapter in the forest's long history began in an age when calamity fell from the sky and a kingdom lay in ruins for 100 years. Here, the Lost Woods became a refuge, not just for the Koroks, but for the most precious relic of a fallen age, the Master Sword itself. The blade that had saved the world so many times now lay broken and powerless, its spirit exhausted by the battle against an evil that had corrupted the very tools meant to defeat it. Princess Zelda, in the final moments before her century-long vigil began, brought the shattered sword to the only place she knew could heal it. The great Deku tree accepted this sacred burden, as he had accepted so many others, cradling the broken blade in roots that pulsed with ancient magic. For 100 years, he watched over the sword's recovery, feeding it with the patient power of growing things, teaching it the slow wisdom of seasons and cycles. When Link finally returned to claim his blade, he found the forest changed yet again. The Koroks had multiplied and spread throughout Hyrule, their playful puzzles and hidden treasures bringing moments of joy to a world still recovering from tragedy. They remembered the hero, who had once been their forest brother, greeting him with the innocent delight of children, welcoming home a beloved friend who had been too long away. The recovery of the Master Sword became a ritual of profound significance. To claim the blade, Link needed not just strength, but spiritual readiness. 13 heart containers worth of life force, representing the full flowering of heroic potential. The moment when he grasped the hilt and drew the sword from its resting place was watched by the entire forest, a communion between hero, spirit, and the living embodiment of nature's enduring power. But even this reunion was not the end of the forest's trials. In the age that followed, when ancient evils stirred once more, and the very foundations of the world shifted, the Lost Woods faced its greatest challenge yet. The gloom that seeped up from the depths infected even this most sacred of places, causing the protective mists to thicken into an impenetrable barrier that no living being could cross. The great Deku tree, ancient and wise as he was, found himself succumbing to a corruption that struck at the very heart of his being. The forest that had always been a place of life and growth became shadowed with sickness. Its protective magic turned inward like an infected wound. The Koroks watched in growing concern as their beloved guardian grew weak, his voice losing the strength that had comforted generations of forest children. The healing came through courage and sacrifice, as it always had. Link descended into the very heart of the great Deku tree, facing the phantom of ancient evil that had taken root in those sacred depths. The battle that followed was more than physical. It was a struggle for the soul of the forest itself, a confrontation between the forces of growth and decay, hope and despair, love and malice. When at last the corruption was purged, and the great Deku tree's strength returned. The forest bloomed with renewed vitality. The lost woods opened once more to those who belonged, while the Koroks resumed their eternal dance of hide and seek, their laughter ringing through groves that had known too much silence. The protective magic flowed clear and strong again, keeping safe the mysteries and wonders that dwelt within the woodland's heart. Throughout all these transformations, through every age and iteration, the Lost Woods remained what it had always been, a place where the lost could find themselves, where the broken could be healed, where innocence could be preserved against the harsh realities of an imperfect world. It stood as a reminder that some things endure, not because they are strong, but because they are necessary, not because they are powerful, but because they are loved. The forest's true magic was never in its ability to confuse intruders or hide its secrets, but in its capacity to nurture what was precious and vulnerable. Whether sheltering Kokiri children in their eternal playground, providing a home for Koroks in their transformed world, or offering sanctuary to a broken sword and the hero who would one day reclaim it, the woods embodied the principle that love makes all things possible. In the rustle of leaves overhead, in the play of light and shadow on the forest floor, in the gentle guidance of paths that led the worthy home and turned the unworthy safely away, the Lost Woods whispered its eternal message, that there are places in this world where magic still lives, where wonder still waits to be discovered, where the child in every heart can find rest and comfort and the strength to face whatever challenges lie beyond the tree line. The great Deku tree stands eternal, his branches reaching toward the sky, while his roots delve deep into the earth's secrets, connecting heaven and earth in a living symbol of endurance and hope. Around him, the forest keeps its watch, protecting what is precious, nurturing what is vulnerable, and offering shelter to all who approach with hearts open to wonder and eyes clear enough to see the magic that flows like lifeblood through every branch and leaf of this most sacred grove, where water and memory intertwine in crystalline beauty, where the very architecture seems to flow like liquid made solid. There stands a realm that embodies the eternal dance between permanence and change. Zora's domain rises from the living rock not as a structure imposed upon nature, but as nature itself given conscious form and purpose. The blue-white stone from which it is carved seems to pulse with an inner light, as if the walls themselves remember the touch of sacred waters that shaped them across countless ages. This is no ordinary palace built by mortal hands, but a marvel that speaks to the deep connection between the Zora people and the elemental forces they call home. Every curve and archway follows the natural flow of water. Every chamber echoes with the gentle music of streams and falls that provide not just beauty, but the very essence of life itself. To walk through Zora's domain is to move through a living symphony where architecture and nature have achieved perfect harmony. In the age when sacred stones held the power to unlock destiny itself, when a young hero first learned that wisdom could be as sharp as any blade, Zora's domain stood as a testament to the sophisticated culture that had flourished here for generations beyond counting. The approach to this aquatic marvel required passage through the winding channels of Zora's river, where crystalline waters carved their path through towering canyon walls like liquid light seeking its source. The river itself served as both highway and guardian, its swift currents carrying those who belonged, while turning away those who sought entry with ill intent. Travelers approaching the domain would find their way blocked by a great waterfall that seemed to cascade from the very sky, its thunder drowning out all other sounds, while its mist created rainbows in the afternoon light. Only when Zelda's lullaby was played at precisely the right location would the waters part, revealing the hidden entrance that led to wonders beyond. Within the domain's heart dwelt King Zora, a monarch whose very presence commanded respect through sheer nobility of bearing, rather than any display of force. His massive form spoke of the strength that flowed in Zora bloodlines, while his wise eyes held depths that reflected the accumulated wisdom of his people. Beside him stood his daughter, Princess Ruto, heir to traditions that stretched back to the beginning of recorded time and guardian of secrets that few outsiders could comprehend. The princess possessed the fierce independence that marked the finest of Zora nobility, combined with a protective instinct toward her people that burned as bright as her father's crown. She moved through the domain's waterways with the grace of one born to aquatic life, equally at home, swimming through the deepest pools or walking the carved pathways that wound between levels of this vertical paradise. Her voice carried the authority of royal blood tempered by genuine care for those under her protection. The culture that surrounded the royal family was unlike anything found in the surface kingdoms. The Zora had developed their civilization around the principle of flow, not just the flow of water that sustained their physical needs, but the flow of time, tradition, and spiritual connection that gave meaning to their existence. Their architecture reflected this philosophy in every detail, from the spiral pathways that seemed to dance upward through the domain's levels to the pools and fountains that served as both practical amenities and sacred spaces. At the domain's apex lay the most sacred of all spaces, Zora's fountain, where Lord Jabu Jabu kept his eternal vigil. This ancient deity, massive beyond comprehension and benevolent beyond measure, served as both protector and spiritual focus for the Zora people. His very presence sanctified the waters of the fountain, while his wisdom guided the decisions of kings and commoners alike. The relationship between the Zora and their patron deity was one of mutual respect and ancient covenant, a bond that had endured since the first Zora emerged from primordial waters to build their civilization. The sacred rituals surrounding Lord Jabu Jabu were complex and beautiful, involving offerings that honored not just the deity himself, but the elemental forces he represented. Young Zora would present gifts of precious stones and rare fish, while the royal family maintained more elaborate ceremonies that renewed the spiritual bonds connecting their people to the living waters of their world. These rituals were not mere formality, but living expressions of a faith that saw the divine in every drop of water, every flowing stream, every life-giving rain. It was into this world of ancient tradition and sacred duty that a young hero ventured, seeking the spiritual stone known as the Zora's Sapphire. His quest led him into the very heart of Lord Jabu Jabu himself, where he discovered that even the most benevolent of deities could fall victim to corruption and pain. The adventure that followed was more than a dungeon to be conquered. It was a healing mission that restored balance to one of Hyrule's most sacred relationships. The moment when Princess Ruto presented the sapphire to Link carried significance far beyond the simple transfer of a mystical artifact. In Zora culture, such a gift between members of opposite genders carried the weight of a marriage proposal, a binding promise that transcended mere alliance to become sacred covenant. The princess bestowed not just a stone, but her heart, not just aid for his quest, but commitment to a shared future that she hoped would unite their peoples in bonds stronger than any political treaty. Yet even as this moment of hope and promise unfolded, darker currents were already flowing toward Zora's domain. The corruption that would eventually claim the sacred realm cast its shadow forward through time, bringing changes that would test every bond and tradition the Zora held dear. When Ganondorf's power finally manifested in full, the domain found itself transformed from sanctuary to prison, its life-giving waters frozen solid by a malice that struck at the very heart of what made the Zora civilization possible. The ice that encased the domain was not merely frozen water, but crystallized despair, reflecting the pain of a people cut off from the element that defined their existence. The red ice that sealed certain passages could only be melted by blue flame, creating a cruel irony where the very fire that could free them was as alien to Zora nature as the ice that trapped them. The domain became a monument to powerlessness, its inhabitants frozen not just in body but in spirit, waiting for a liberation that seemed increasingly impossible. The source of this corruption lay deep beneath Lake Hylia, where the water temple had fallen under the influence of Morpha, a creature of pure malice that poisoned the very springs from which all water flowed. The temple that had once been a place of worship and purification became a trap where sacred traditions were twisted into instruments of torment. The restoration of the temple required not just physical courage, but spiritual cleansing, a process that restored the natural order while healing wounds that went deeper than ice or stone. As ages turned and timelines shifted, bringing new challenges and possibilities, Zora's domain faced yet another transformation. In the era when the Great Flood reshaped the world, when the old kingdoms vanished beneath waves of divine judgment, the Zora themselves underwent a change as profound as their domain's submersion. The fish people who had thrived in freshwater streams and mountain pools found themselves ill-suited to the salt oceans that now covered their world. The evolution that followed was both necessary and miraculous. Over generations, the Zora transformed into the Rito, trading their aquatic heritage for mastery of the skies. Their domain was abandoned to the depths, becoming part of the sunken kingdom that lay beneath the great sea's waves. Yet the transformation was not loss, but adaptation, proof of the resilience that had always defined Zora culture, even when their forms and homes had changed beyond recognition. But in the timeline where calamity fell from artificial skies and ancient technology turned against its creators, Zora's domain endured to face challenges that tested the very foundations of their society. Here, the architectural marvel that had sheltered them for millennia became both fortress and memorial, a place where the weight of loss pressed down like the mountain stone that surrounded their haven. The domain of this era rose even more majestically than its predecessors, its blue luminescence visible from great distances as a beacon of hope in a world gone dark. The fish-shaped crown that adorned its highest towers caught and reflected the light of moon and stars, while the terraced pools and flowing channels created a constant music of moving water that spoke of life persisting despite all adversity. The great bridge that spanned Ruto Lake became a pilgrimage route for those seeking the wisdom and healing that the Zora domain represented. Within the throne room at the domain's heart, King Dorephan held court with the dignity befitting one who had witnessed both triumph and tragedy beyond measure. His massive form bore the scars of battles, fought not for conquest, but for protection, while his voice carried the weight of decisions that had saved his people at costs that would haunt him through all his remaining years. Beside him stood Prince Sidon, heir to a legacy that included both the glory of ancient Zora traditions and the fresh wounds of recent loss. The statue that dominated the domain's central plaza told a story that every Zora knew by heart, though few could speak of it without tears. Princess Mipha, beloved daughter and gifted healer, stood frozen in luminous stone as a reminder of sacrifice that had saved a kingdom while breaking the hearts of all who loved her. The statue captured her in a moment of serene determination, her hands positioned as if still offering the healing touch that had once mended countless wounds. The tragedy of Mipha's story lay not just in her death, but in the love that had remained unspoken until it was too late. The armor she had crafted for Link, wrought with the traditional patterns that marked a Zora's intended bride gift, remained unworn, while its maker lay entombed within a corrupted divine beast. The ceremonies that should have celebrated a union between Zora and Hylian became instead memorials for what might have been, love letters written in stone and water that would never find their intended recipient. Prince Sidon carried this burden with the grace that marked true royalty, transforming his grief into determination to honor his sister's memory through service to their people. His friendship with Link became a bridge between past and present, a relationship that honored Mipha's sacrifice while looking forward to possibilities she had not lived to see. The prince's eventual rise to leadership was marked not by the claiming of inherited power, but by the earning of respect through countless acts of courage and compassion. The trials that tested the domain in this era went beyond the personal tragedies that marked individual lives. The corruption of divine beast Vah Ruta transformed their greatest technological achievement into an existential threat, as the mechanical elephant's endless tears threatened to flood the very kingdom it had been created to protect. The creature that should have been their guardian became, instead, a source of constant crisis, its grief made manifest in waters that knew no boundaries or restraint. The solution to this crisis required not just technical skill, but emotional healing, for Vah Ruta's malfunction was rooted in the spiritual wound left by Mipha's death. The divine beast mourned its pilot with a sorrow that transcended mechanical function, its tears a physical manifestation of loss that refused to be contained. Only when Link entered the beast and faced the phantom of evil that had corrupted its systems could the healing begin, allowing both machine and kingdom to find peace at last. The revelation that came with the beast's cleansing extended far beyond the immediate crisis. The Zora discovered that their domain sat above an ancient network of waterworks that predated their civilization, suggesting that others had recognized the sacred nature of these waters long before the first Zora architects had carved their first chambers. The engineering marvels hidden beneath the reservoir spoke of a connection between water and wisdom that transcended any single culture or era. When new upheavals brought fresh challenges to the domain, the Zora once again demonstrated their capacity for adaptation without abandoning their essential nature. The sludge that infected their waters during the crisis of ascending islands was not merely a physical contamination, but a spiritual pollution that struck at the heart of their relationship with the element they held sacred. The cleansing that followed required both ancient wisdom and innovative thinking, proving that tradition and progress could work together when guided by genuine understanding of what truly mattered. Prince Sidon's evolution into King Sidon marked not just a political transition, but a spiritual completion of the healing process that had begun with his sister's death. His marriage to Yona, a princess from distant Zora territories, represented hope for the future while honoring the past. The ceremonies that celebrated their union incorporated both ancient traditions and new customs, creating a synthesis that strengthened rather than diluted the essential character of Zora culture. The domain that emerged from these trials was both unchanged and completely transformed. Its physical beauty remained as breathtaking as ever. Its blue luminescence still drew travelers from across the kingdom, and its waters still sang their eternal songs of life and renewal. Yet beneath this familiar surface flowed currents of deeper understanding, wisdom earned through suffering, and strength forged in the crucible of loss and recovery. The memorial to Mifa, relocated to the mountain heights where her spirit could watch over the domain from above, became a place of pilgrimage, where the meaning of sacrifice was contemplated by all who sought to understand the true nature of heroism. The princess who had died too young became in death a teacher whose lessons reached far beyond the boundaries of her own people, showing that love, freely given, never truly dies, but transforms into something that enriches all who encounter its legacy. In the gentle flow of water through carved channels, in the play of light across crystal pools, in the eternal music of falls and fountains that sang the domain's ancient songs, the Zora's deepest truths found expression. Theirs was a civilization built on the understanding that all life flows from the same source, that wisdom comes from learning to move with rather than against the currents of existence, and that the greatest strength lies not in resistance to change, but in the ability to remain essentially oneself while adapting to whatever new channels life might carve. The domain stands eternal, its waters flowing as they have always flowed, carrying with them the memories of all who have drunk from its springs and the hopes of all who will yet come, seeking the peace that flows like a river through the heart of this most graceful of kingdoms. In the heart of fire and stone, where the earth's molten blood flows through volcanic veins and the air shimmers with heat that would humble desert winds, brotherhood burns eternal. Death. Mountain rises like a monument to endurance itself, its smoking peak a beacon visible across all of Hyrule, while deep within its fiery chambers dwells a people who have made strength their creed and loyalty their sacred bond. The Gorons call this scalding realm home, and in their culture of brotherhood and blazing forges, they have created something remarkable, a civilization that finds beauty in the harshest conditions and builds community in places where others would find only desolation. The mountain that shelters the Goron people is no gentle hill, but a living volcano whose moods range from peaceful slumber to earth-shaking fury. Steam vents pierce the rocky slopes like breathing holes, releasing the mountain's inner heat in great billowing clouds that carry the scent of sulfur and molten stone. Rivers of lava carve their ancient paths down the mountainside, creating a landscape that seems to belong more to the realm of dragons than to any place where mortal beings might choose to dwell. Yet it is precisely this hostile environment that shaped the Goron character, forging a people as enduring as the stone they consume, and as warm as the fires that burn at the mountain's heart. Their philosophy is elegantly simple, that hardship shared becomes strength multiplied, that the strongest individual is nothing compared to the united power of the brotherhood, and that true wealth lies not in gold or jewels, but in the bonds that tie soul to soul across the generations. In the era when spiritual stones held the keys to destiny, and young heroes learned that courage could open any door, Death Mountain presented itself as both challenge and sanctuary to those brave enough to approach its slopes. The path upward was treacherous, marked by falling rocks that could crush the unwary, and temperatures that tested the limits of Hylian endurance. Even with royal permission and the proper gear, the climb demanded respect for the mountain's power and understanding of its moods. The Goron city of this age was carved directly into the mountain's living rock, its chambers connected by passages that wound through the stone like arteries through a giant's body. The architecture spoke of a people who saw no separation between their dwelling place and the mountain itself. They did not build upon the rock, but within it, creating spaces that felt less like constructed rooms than natural caverns blessed with careful craftsmanship. The throne room where the Goron leaders held court was perhaps the most impressive chamber in all the city, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows, while the floor vibrated with the subtle rhythms of the mountain's heartbeat. Here, surrounded by the symbols of their ancient culture, the Goron elders made the decisions that affected their entire people. The walls were decorated with carvings that told the story of their race, epic tales of heroes who had faced down dragons, of craftsmen whose skill had become legend, of brotherhood that had endured through every trial the world could devise. The culture that flourished in these stone halls was built around the concept of shared strength and mutual support. Every Goron was both individual and part of the greater whole, free to pursue his own path, while remaining bound by ties that went deeper than blood or law. They called each other brother not as mere courtesy, but as recognition of a truth that defined their existence, that they were all children of the mountain, all shaped by the same fires, all sustained by the same unshakable foundation. Their relationship with the mountain's dangers was one of respectful partnership rather than fearful avoidance. When Dodongo's cavern became infested with the great lizard creatures that gave it its name, threatening the food supply that kept Goron City fed, it was not seen as a disaster to be lamented, but as a challenge to be met with typical Goron determination. The cavern had always been part of their territory, and they would reclaim it through courage and community effort, just as their ancestors had done with every obstacle the mountain had placed in their path. The spiritual significance of the Goron's ruby, one of the 3 stones that would unlock the path to the Master Sword, was deeply woven into their understanding of their place in the world's greater pattern. The ruby was not merely a treasure to be guarded, but a symbol of the fiery spirit that burned at the heart of Goron culture, the passion for life, the dedication to craft, the fierce love of brotherhood that defined everything they were. To entrust it to a young hero was to offer not just a mystical artifact, but a piece of their very soul. Yet even the strongest stone can be tested beyond its limits, and the Goron people would face trials that challenged the very foundations of their society. When Ganondorf's corruption spread across the land like a plague of shadows, Death Mountain itself fell under the influence of evil that transformed their sacred home into a prison. The Fire Temple, once a place of worship and reverence for the mountain's power, became a chamber of horrors where Goron prisoners awaited a fate too terrible to contemplate. The dragon Volvagia, resurrected by dark magic to serve as Ganondorf's instrument of terror, represented the inversion of everything the Gorons held sacred. Where they saw fire as a source of life and community, the dragon brought only death and destruction. Where they celebrated the mountain's strength, Volvagia used that same power to threaten their very existence. The battle to reclaim their temple was more than a physical confrontation. It was a spiritual war for the soul of Death Mountain itself. The hero who came to their aid wielded the megaton hammer, a tool that spoke to Goron craftsmanship at its finest. This was no mere weapon, but a masterwork of engineering that channeled the wielder's strength through principles of leverage and momentum that Goron smiths had perfected over centuries. In the hands of one worthy of their trust, it became an instrument of liberation. Each blow struck against evil, a vindication of the Goron belief that strength guided by righteousness could overcome any darkness. In another timeline, where different choices led to different sorrows, the Goron people faced a crisis that struck at the heart of their identity in an entirely different way. The eternal spring that had always characterized Death Mountain gave way to an unnatural winter that threatened to freeze the volcanic fires that sustained all Goron life. The snow that blanketed their homeland was not merely cold, but spiritually wrong, a violation of the natural order that left the mountain's children stranded in a landscape they no longer recognized. The tragedy of Darmani III became a defining moment in Goron history, a reminder that even the mightiest heroes could fall when facing forces beyond their comprehension. Darmani had been everything a Goron aspired to be, strong in body, pure in heart, devoted to his people above all else. His attempt to restore warmth to the mountain through personal sacrifice became the stuff of legend, though the legend was written in sorrow rather than triumph. The mask that preserved Darmani's essence after his death became more than a magical artifact. It was a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of spirits, allowing his strength to aid others even after his own journey had ended. The young hero who inherited his power also inherited his responsibility, learning that true strength came not from personal might, but from the willingness to use that might in service of others. The graveyard where Darmani finally found rest spoke to the Goron understanding of death as transformation rather than ending. The crystalline formations that marked Goron burial sites were not mere decorations, but symbols of the belief that, like carbon transformed by pressure and heat into diamond, the Goron spirit became something more beautiful through the trials of existence. Death was not defeat, but graduation, not loss, but evolution into a higher form of being. When twilight fell across the land in a later age, bringing with it invasions from a realm of shadow, Death Mountain once again became a battleground where the Goron people's courage was tested against forces that sought to corrupt everything they held sacred. The twilight that infected their homeland was more insidious than the ice that had once threatened them, for it brought not cold, but a spiritual numbness that sapped the very will to resist. The bridge that spanned the great chasm became the site of one of the most dramatic confrontations in Goron history, where King Bulblin and his mounted warriors sought to prevent aid from reaching those who needed it most. The joust that followed was more than a battle. It was a test of principles, a clash between those who used strength to protect and those who used it to dominate. The hero's victory on that bridge resonated through Goron culture as proof that their ideals could triumph even against overwhelming odds. In the age when calamity fell from artificial skies and ancient guardians turned against their creators, Death Mountain faced perhaps its greatest trial yet. The divine beast Va Rudania, created to protect the Goron people, instead became a source of constant danger as its corrupted programming drove it to patrol the mountain slopes with hostile intent. The very sight that should have filled Goron hearts with pride, their champion's divine beast standing guard over their homeland, became instead a reminder of how completely their world had been turned upside down. Daruk the champion had been the embodiment of everything noble in Goron culture. His strength was legendary, but it was his heart that truly set him apart. A capacity for joy and friendship that could warm even the coldest souls. His laugh could be heard echoing through the mountain's passages, a sound that became synonymous with the hope and courage that defined the Goron spirit. When he fell during the great calamity, fighting to the end, against the corruption that claimed his divine beast, a light went out in Goron City that took 100 years to rekindle. The memorial carvings that honored Daruk and other Goron heroes became pilgrimage sites where the meaning of sacrifice was contemplated by all who sought to understand what it truly meant to be a champion. The images carved in stone told stories that went beyond individual achievement to celebrate the principle that strength without compassion was meaningless, that power without love was empty, that true heroism lay not in personal glory, but in service to something greater than oneself. Yunobo, Daruk's descendant, carried the weight of this legacy with a humility that initially masked his own potential for greatness. The young Goron's journey from frightened youth to confident leader mirrored the broader healing process that Goron society underwent as it recovered from the trauma of the calamity. His friendship with Link became a bridge between past and present, a relationship that honored the memory of fallen champions while looking forward to new possibilities. The challenges that Yunobo faced went beyond the personal growth that marks any coming-of-age story. The very nature of his protective ability, the power to encase himself in an impenetrable sphere of stone, seemed to symbolize the defensive mindset that had overtaken Goron culture in the wake of their losses. Learning to use this power not just for protection, but as a tool for helping others marked his transformation from survivor to leader, from one who endured hardship to one who helped others overcome it. The crisis that struck during the age of ascending islands brought new trials that tested whether the lessons learned through past suffering had truly taken root. The corruption that spread through Goron society in the form of tainted rock roast represented a different kind of threat, not the obvious danger of dragon or twilight, but the subtle poison of complacency and false comfort. The marbled delicacy that the Gorons came to crave was literally draining the life from them, leaving them weakened and susceptible to influences that their ancestors would have recognized and resisted immediately. The masks and strange behavior that affected the Goron leadership during this crisis spoke to the insidious nature of corruption that came disguised as gift rather than threat. The phantom of the princess who offered these false gifts knew exactly how to appeal to Goron nature through generosity and the promise of prosperity for their people. Only when the deception was revealed could the healing begin, allowing Goron society to rediscover the authentic sources of strength that had sustained them through every previous trial. The mining operations that spread across Death Mountain during this period represented both opportunity and danger for Goron culture. The abundance of resources that could be extracted from the mountain's depths offered unprecedented prosperity, but it also raised questions about the balance between taking from the mountain and giving back to it. The Gorons had always understood themselves to be partners rather than masters of their volcanic home, and maintaining that relationship required constant attention to the spiritual as well as the physical dimensions of their activities. The forges that had always been the heart of Goron craftsmanship took on new significance as the people rediscovered their calling as creators rather than merely consumers. The weapons and tools that emerged from their workshops were not just functional objects, but works of art that embodied the Goron understanding of beauty, simple, strong, and perfectly suited to their purpose. Each hammer that rolled from their anvils carried with it something of the mountain's enduring strength and the Brotherhood's unshakable solidarity. The festivals and celebrations that marked important moments in Goron life became opportunities to reaffirm the bonds that held their society together. The rolling competitions that tested speed and agility, the strength contests that celebrated physical prowess, the communal feasts where stories were shared and traditions passed down, all served to reinforce the understanding that individual achievement meant nothing unless it contributed to the welfare of the whole. Through every trial and triumph, through ages of ice and fire, shadow and light, corruption and renewal, the Goron people remained true to the principles that had shaped them from the beginning. Their understanding of brotherhood transcended mere kinship to embrace all who proved themselves worthy of trust and loyalty. Their relationship with Death Mountain exemplified the possibility of finding home in the most unlikely places, of building community in conditions that would scatter lesser peoples to the winds. The eternal fires that burn in Goron forges speak to something deeper than mere craftsmanship. They represent the undying spirit of a people who have learned that true strength comes not from individual prowess, but from the bonds that connect heart to heart across the generations. In their mountain fastness, surrounded by the tools of their trade, and warmed by fires that have burned since the world was young, the Gorons continue their ancient work of transforming raw stone into objects of beauty and power, just as they transform strangers into brothers and hardship into wisdom. A sacred space that transcends time itself, appearing when heroes need it most, standing as both sanctuary and threshold between the mortal world and realms of divine power. The Temple of Time exists not merely as architecture, but as an idea made manifest. The notion that certain moments in history require a place where past and future can meet, where the flow of temporal rivers can be altered by those brave enough to step outside the normal boundaries of existence. Across every timeline, in every age where darkness threatens to overwhelm light, this temple appears in one form or another, adapting its shape to serve the needs of each era while maintaining its essential purpose as guardian of the blade that seals evil's fate. In the earliest age of which legends speak, when the surface world still bore fresh scars from the war between goddess and demon. The original Temple of Time stood in the desert wastes of Lanayru. This was no grand cathedral reaching toward the heavens, but an open courtyard where time itself seemed to gather like morning mist, where the very air shimmered with possibilities, yet unrealized. The gate of time that dominated this sacred space was a marvel of divine engineering, its crystalline surface reflecting not just light, but the images of potential futures and half-remembered pasts. The temple's simplicity belied its profound significance. Stone platforms arranged in geometric patterns created a focus for temporal energies that few mortal minds could fully comprehend, while the great crest that towered above served as both anchor and beacon for the forces that governed causality itself. This was where the desperate flight through time began, where a young woman who was both princess and goddess discovered that sometimes the only way to prevent disaster was to ensure that the heroes who could stop it were properly prepared for their destiny. The tragedy that unfolded around this ancient temple spoke to the terrible costs that heroism sometimes demanded. When the gate of time was destroyed to prevent pursuit by forces of evil, it severed connections that had existed since the world's foundation, forcing those who would save the future to find new ways to bridge the gap between what was and what must be. The temple became a monument to sacrifice, its broken portal a reminder that even divine power had limits when confronted with the stubborn realities of choice and consequence. Yet from this destruction came the seeds of renewal, for the temple's essential nature could not be destroyed by the mere shattering of stone and crystal. The need for a place where time could be commanded persisted, and so new temples arose in new locations, each adapted to serve the requirements of its age, while maintaining the sacred purpose that had always defined these mystical sites. The Gate of Time was rebuilt not once, but many times, its design evolving while its function remained constant, to provide passage for those who must travel through temporal streams to fulfill their appointed roles in the great pattern of destiny. In the era when spiritual stones held the keys to the sacred realm, when a young hero first learned that drawing a blade could cost 7 years of life, the Temple of Time found new form in the heart of what would become Castletown. This iteration was grander than its predecessor, with soaring vaults and stained glass windows that cast rainbow patterns across floors, worn smooth by generations of pilgrims seeking divine guidance. The sacred space had evolved from desert courtyard to Gothic cathedral, its architecture speaking of a civilization that had learned to channel spiritual power through beauty as well as function. The door of time that sealed the Master Sword's chamber was a masterwork of both craft and magic, its surface carved with symbols that told the story of creation itself, while mechanisms of impossible complexity ensured that only the worthy could claim the blade that lay beyond. The 3 pedestals that stood before this portal were positioned with mathematical precision, their placement calculated to focus the power of the spiritual stones in ways that would unlock not just a door, but a pathway to realms beyond mortal understanding. The chamber that housed the Master Sword was perhaps the most sacred space in all of Hyrule, a place where time moved differently, and the very air hummed with concentrated power. The blade rested in a pedestal of pure light, its steel reflecting not just the images of those who approached, but glimpses of the destiny that awaited them. The stained glass windows that surrounded this holy of holies depicted the sages who had helped forge the blade, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal vigilance as they maintained their watch over the weapon that could seal evil's power. The tragedy that befell the young hero who first drew the blade from its resting place became the defining story of this temple's age. 7 years lost to enchanted sleep, 7 years stolen from a childhood that could never be reclaimed, 7 years during which the world fell into darkness, while its destined savior lay trapped between waking and sleeping, between child and adult, between the past he had known and the future he must embrace. The temple became both sanctuary and prison, salvation and curse, hope and heartbreak, all woven together in the complex pattern that defined the relationship between destiny and choice. The journeys back and forth through time that followed created ripples in the temporal stream that would be felt for generations to come. Each return to the temple of time, each replacement of the master sword in its pedestal, each journey between childhood and adulthood created new possibilities while closing off others. The temple stood as witness to the hero's gradual understanding that power came with prices that could never be fully calculated in advance, that saving the world sometimes meant sacrificing the very things that made that world worth saving. The final moment when the blade was returned to its resting place carried significance that extended far beyond the immediate restoration of peace to Hyrule. This was the moment when time itself was rewound, when the 7 lost years were restored and the future given a chance to unfold differently. The temple served as the anchor point for this ultimate act of temporal manipulation, its sacred space providing the stability needed to restructure the very foundations of reality without destroying the essential patterns that held existence together. Yet even this was not the end of the temple's story, for in other timelines and other ages, new challenges arose that demanded new forms of divine intervention. When twilight fell across the land like a plague of shadow, when the barriers between worlds grew thin and creatures of nightmare stalked through familiar fields, the Temple of Time found itself relocated to an unexpected sanctuary deep within the sacred grove of the Faron Woods. This iteration of the sacred space carried an air of mystery that surpassed even its predecessors. Hidden behind barriers that only the worthy could pass, guarded by trials that tested both courage and wisdom, the temple had become something more than a building. It was a secret preserved by the forest itself, a treasure that revealed itself only to those who understood the deeper rhythms of nature and magic. The ruins that surrounded it spoke of ages long past, while the puzzles that protected it challenged visitors to prove their understanding of principles that went beyond mere strength or cunning. The Master Sword's chamber in this forest temple was perhaps the most beautiful of all its resting places, with walls that seemed to breathe with the life of growing things and light that filtered down through leaves instead of stained glass. The blade waited here, not in isolated splendor, but as part of the living world, its power connected to the same forces that sustained the ancient trees and singing streams of the sacred grove. The guardian statues that protected this chamber were more than mere obstacles. They were tests that revealed the true character of those who sought to claim the legendary blade. The riddle of how the temple had come to rest in this unlikely location became part of its mystique. Some said it had always been here, hidden by enchantments that made it seem to be elsewhere. Others believed it had been moved by powers beyond mortal understanding, transported through space as well as time to await the moment when it would be needed again. The truth was perhaps less important than the symbolism, that sacred spaces could be found anywhere, that divine power was not limited by geography or architecture, that the temple existed wherever and whenever heroes needed it most. In the age that followed the great calamity, when ancient evils stirred once more, and the very foundations of the world shifted beneath ascending islands, the Temple of Time revealed new facets of its eternal nature. The ruins that stood on the Great Plateau spoke of a temple that had been present at the very founding of Hyrule, witness to the establishment of the kingdom and guardian of its deepest secrets. These stones had seen the rise and fall of dynasties, the coming and going of heroes, the endless cycle of destruction and renewal that defined the relationship between order and chaos. The revelation that this plateau was indeed the birthplace of the kingdom added layers of meaning to every weathered stone and broken arch. The temple had not been built here by chance, but had been placed at the very heart of Hyrule's origin story, marking the spot where divine will had first shaped mortal destiny into the patterns that would guide the kingdom through all its future trials. The proximity to the Shrine of Resurrection was no coincidence. Both served the same essential function of preserving and protecting that which was too precious to lose. Yet perhaps the most remarkable transformation came when the temple was literally lifted to the heavens, carried to the Sky Islands as part of the protective measures that ancient wisdom had prepared for the time of greatest need. The great Sky Island cluster that served as sanctuary and training ground for a hero. Beginning his final journey was dominated by this aerial temple, its familiar architecture now surrounded by clouds instead of forests or castle walls. The Temple of Time, in its celestial form, represented the ultimate expression of its fundamental nature, a place where the normal rules of existence could be suspended in service of higher purposes. Here, surrounded by the endless blue of sky and cloud, the ancient rituals took on new meaning while maintaining their essential function. The waterworks and machinery that now filled the temple's chambers spoke of a fusion between divine purpose and practical engineering that characterized the Zonai approach to sacred architecture. The platform at the temple's heart, where past and future met in the person of a golden orb that defied easy explanation, became the site of perhaps the most mysterious ceremony in all the temple's long history. The transfer of the broken master sword through time itself, carried by love and sacrifice to an age where it could be healed and made whole again, represented the temple's ultimate purpose, to serve as a bridge between what is and what must be, a place where the impossible becomes merely improbable, and the improbable becomes inevitable. The dragon that burst through the clouds in that moment of transcendent magic was both ending and beginning, both sacrifice and gift, both the conclusion of one story and the opening chapter of another. The temple bore witness to this transformation, as it had witnessed so many others, its ancient stones holding steady, while reality itself shifted around them. The sight of Princess Zelda in her transformed state, carrying the healed blade through skies that remembered her passing, became part of the temple's eternal memory. The cyclical nature of heroism that the temple embodied was perhaps its most profound teaching. Each hero who entered its chambers was both unique individual and link in an endless chain, both first of his kind and latest in a line stretching back to the beginning of recorded time. The master sword that each one claimed was simultaneously the same blade that had served every previous hero, and a weapon newly forged for the challenges of their particular age. The lessons learned within the temple's walls went beyond the mere mastery of sword and shield to encompass deeper truths about the nature of courage, wisdom, and power. The trials that led to the blade's claiming were designed not to test physical strength, but to reveal the content of the heart, to ensure that divine power was entrusted only to those who would use it in service of something greater than themselves. The temple served as both school and sanctuary, teaching ground and graduation platform for souls preparing to take their place in the great work of protecting light from darkness. The music that echoed through the temple's chambers in every age spoke to its timeless nature. Whether the ancient melodies were played on harp or ocarina, sung by choir or hummed by solitary pilgrims, they carried the same essential message: that time is not the master of destiny, but its servant; that the past informs the present without controlling it; that the future remains open to those brave enough to step forward into uncertainty, guided only by the light of their convictions. The temple of time stands eternal, its form changing with the ages, while its purpose remains constant. In its chambers, heroes learn that true strength comes not from the blade they wield, but from the heart that guides it; that the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through sacrifice; that the temple itself is not the destination, but the doorway; not the end of the journey, but the place where the real adventure begins. In its sacred spaces, time reveals its greatest secret: that every ending is also a beginning, every conclusion an invitation to start again. Every hero's rest a preparation for the next awakening, when the world calls out once more for those brave enough to answer. In the shifting sands lies a culture of strength, tradition, and survival, where the desert's harsh embrace has forged a people, as enduring as the dunes themselves, and as fierce as the storms that sweep across their homeland. The Gerudo Desert stretches endlessly under a sun that shows no mercy, its golden waves broken only by ancient rock formations and the occasional oasis that offers respite to travelers brave enough to venture into this realm of scorching winds and burning sand. Here, where most would find only desolation, the Gerudo have built a civilization that celebrates the power of women, the bonds of sisterhood, and the strength that comes from thriving in conditions that would defeat lesser peoples. The fortress that dominates the western reaches of this desert kingdom speaks to the martial heritage that defines Gerudo culture. Rising from the sand like a monument to determination itself, the Gerudo fortress stands as both home and statement of purpose, a declaration that these warrior women fear nothing that the desert or any enemy might bring against them. Its walls are built not just to withstand the physical assault of siege engines, but to endure the relentless grinding of sandstorms that could strip flesh from bone, given time and opportunity. In the age when spiritual stones held the power to unlock destiny, and young heroes learned that courage sometimes meant facing the impossible, the Gerudo fortress was a place where few outsiders dared to tread. The warriors who defended its walls were legendary for their skill with curved blades that moved like extensions of their own bodies, their agility that allowed them to strike from seemingly impossible angles, their coordination that transformed individual fighters into something approaching a force of nature. The culture that flourished within these walls was built around principles that set the Gerudo apart from every other people in the known world. Theirs was a society where strength was measured not just in physical prowess, but in the courage to face adversity with dignity, where beauty was found not in fragility, but in the fierce pride that burned in every warrior's eyes, where tradition was preserved not through rigid adherence to outdated customs, but through the wisdom to adapt ancient truths to meet present challenges. The most defining aspect of Gerudo society was the rarity of male births among their people. Only once in a century did their bloodline produce a son, and by ancient law, this male child was destined to become their king regardless of his character or worthiness for leadership. This tradition had given them Ganondorf, a ruler whose strength and charisma had initially seemed like gifts from the desert itself, but whose hunger for power would ultimately bring ruin to everything the Gerudo held sacred. The relationship between the Gerudo and their king was complex, marked by loyalty that warred with growing unease as Ganondorf's true nature revealed itself. The warrior women who had fought and died in his name slowly came to understand that their greatest strength, their ability to stand together against any threat, had been turned into a weakness by a leader who saw them not as sisters in arms, but as tools to be used in pursuit of his own ambitions. The haunted wasteland that stretched beyond their fortress was both barrier and testing ground, a place where the desert's power reached its most concentrated form. The endless sandstorms that swept through this desolate region were said to drive travelers mad with visions of things that could not be, while the shifting dunes erased all landmarks and left even experienced navigators lost in a maze of their own confusion. Only the Gerudo, with their deep understanding of the desert's moods and patterns, could traverse this wasteland with any hope of survival. The spirit temple that rose from the deepest reaches of the wasteland served as the ultimate expression of Gerudo spiritual beliefs. This ancient structure, carved from stone that seemed to glow with inner fire, housed mysteries that connected the desert people to powers that predated their civilization. The trials contained within its chambers tested not just physical strength, but spiritual fortitude, demanding that those who sought its treasures prove themselves worthy through deeds that demonstrated understanding of the deeper truths that governed existence. The irony that this most sacred of Gerudo sites became a battleground in the war against their own corrupted king was not lost on those who lived through those dark days. The temple that should have been their greatest source of pride became instead a monument to the tragedy of power without wisdom, strength without conscience, tradition without the moral foundation that should have guided its application. Yet the Gerudo proved that they were more than the sum of their circumstances, more resilient than even the desert that had shaped them. In the timeline where the Great Flood reshaped the world, where ancient kingdoms vanished beneath waves of divine judgment, the warrior women of the desert underwent a transformation, as remarkable as it was necessary. Faced with a world where their homeland had become an endless ocean, they embraced change with the same fierce determination that had always characterized their approach to challenges. The evolution from desert warriors to sea pirates was both natural and revolutionary. The skills that had served them well in fortress raids, the ability to move silently, strike swiftly, and coordinate complex maneuvers under pressure, translated perfectly to life aboard the ships that became their new homes. The curved blades that had flashed in desert sunlight now gleamed under ocean stars, while the tactical brilliance that had made them legendary on land found new expression in naval combat. The forsaken fortress that served as their base of operations in this flooded world bore the scars of transformation while retaining the essential character that marked all Gerudo architecture. The watchtowers that had once scanned desert horizons for approaching enemies now kept vigil over sea lanes, where merchant vessels and rival pirates plied their trade. The training grounds that had echoed with the clash of practice weapons now rang with the sounds of sailors learning to read wind and current as their ancestors had read the patterns of shifting sand. The cultural adaptation that accompanied this geographic transformation was perhaps even more remarkable than the physical changes to their environment. The Gerudo pirates developed new traditions that honored their desert heritage while embracing the realities of their maritime existence. The songs they sang while working the rigging carried melodies that their grandmothers had hummed while crossing the wasteland, while the stories they told around evening fires connected their present adventures to the ancient legends of their people. The sisterhood that had always been the foundation of Gerudo society found new expression in the bonds forged between crew members who depended on each other for survival in ways that even desert warriors had rarely experienced. The trust required to work together in a storm, the coordination needed to board an enemy vessel, the loyalty demanded by life in close quarters aboard ships that became floating homes, all served to strengthen the connections that made the Gerudo more than just a collection of individuals sharing common ancestry. In yet another timeline, where twilight fell across the land like a plague of shadows and the barriers between worlds grew thin, the Gerudo faced challenges that tested their adaptability in entirely different ways. The invasion from the Twilight Realm brought enemies who fought with strategies and weapons unlike anything the desert warriors had encountered, forcing them to develop new tactics while maintaining the core principles that had always guided their approach to combat. The resistance movement that emerged during this period of occupation demonstrated that Gerudo courage could not be broken by any force, no matter how alien or overwhelming. The women who continued to fight in the shadows after their fortress fell showed that their strength came not from walls or weapons, but from the unshakable belief that freedom was worth any sacrifice. Their guerrilla campaigns against the Twilight invaders became legendary examples of how determination and tactical brilliance could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. When the age of the Great Calamity arrived, bringing with it artificial guardians turned against their creators and divine beasts corrupted by ancient evil, the Gerudo faced perhaps their greatest test yet. The young chief Riju, thrust into leadership at an age when she should have been learning from her elders rather than bearing responsibility for her people's survival, embodied both the vulnerability and the resilience that characterized her generation's response to unprecedented challenges. The burden of inheriting power too early was made even heavier by the weight of recent tragedy. The murder of Riju's mother by the Yiga clan had robbed the Gerudo not just of their leader, but of the wisdom and experience that should have guided the transition to new leadership. The young chief found herself forced to make decisions that would affect thousands of lives, while still grappling with personal grief that had no time to heal properly. The Thunder Helm that became the symbol of Riju's authority was more than just ceremonial headgear. It was a repository of ancient power that connected each chief to the accumulated strength of all who had worn it before. The theft of this sacred artifact by the Yiga clan was an attack not just on Riju's personal legitimacy, but on the spiritual foundation of Gerudo society itself. The recovery of the helm became both practical necessity and symbolic victory, proof that the young chief was worthy of the trust her people had placed in her. The divine Beast Va Naboris, named for an ancient Gerudo sage and designed to protect the Desert Kingdom, became instead a source of constant crisis as its corrupted programming drove it to wander the wasteland in patterns that seemed designed to maximize chaos and destruction. The sandstorms that followed in its wake were beyond anything the desert had produced naturally, while the lightning that discharged from its systems turned the sky itself into a weapon that could strike without warning. The partnership between Chief Riju and the returning hero Link represented a new chapter in Gerudo history, one where ancient traditions of female leadership found expression through collaboration rather than isolation. The young chief's willingness to work with an outsider while maintaining her authority over her own people demonstrated the kind of wisdom that suggested her early assumption of power might prove to be a blessing rather than a burden. The trials that followed tested not just Riju's leadership skills, but her understanding of what it meant to be Gerudo in an age when the old certainties no longer applied. The divine beast that should have been their greatest protection had become their most dangerous enemy, while the hero who offered to help them was male in a society that had traditionally been led exclusively by women. Navigating these contradictions required a flexibility that honored tradition while embracing necessary change. The cleansing of Va Naboris represented more than just the solution to a tactical problem. It was a spiritual victory that restored the connection between the Gerudo people and the divine forces that had always watched over their desert home. The moment when the great mechanical camel took its place as guardian rather than threat marked the beginning of a new era in Gerudo history, one where ancient power served contemporary needs without losing its essential character. When new upheavals brought fresh challenges to the Desert Kingdom, the Gerudo once again demonstrated their capacity for adaptation without abandonment of core principles. The underground shelter that protected them during the crisis of ascending islands spoke to the practical wisdom that had always characterized their approach to survival. When the surface became uninhabitable, they created new spaces rather than simply enduring the hardship. The ancient mural that held the key to discovering the Lightning Temple revealed connections between contemporary challenges and the deep history of the Gerudo people. The pyramid structure that emerged from the sand when the puzzle was solved was not just a dungeon to be conquered, but a repository of cultural memory that connected Riju's generation to the wisdom of their ancestors. The trials contained within its chambers tested understanding of Gerudo values rather than mere physical prowess. The evolution of Chief Riju from uncertain youth to confident leader mirrored the broader development of Gerudo society as it learned to balance respect for tradition with the flexibility needed to meet unprecedented challenges. Her friendship with Princess Zelda, her partnership with heroes from other cultures, her willingness to share knowledge and resources with former enemies, all represented new expressions of ancient Gerudo values rather than abandonment of their heritage. The secret shops and hidden traditions that flourished within Gerudo town spoke to the complexity of a culture that had learned to preserve its essential character while adapting to changing circumstances. The passwords and coded communications that protected these underground networks demonstrated the same tactical thinking that had made Gerudo warriors legendary, applied now to the preservation of cultural practices that might not survive in the open air of changing times. The water systems that sustained life in the desert oasis revealed the engineering brilliance that had always been necessary for Gerudo survival, but was rarely celebrated in stories that focused on their martial prowess. The ability to create abundance in the midst of scarcity, to build beauty in harsh conditions, to maintain communities where others saw only emptiness. These were perhaps the greatest achievements of Gerudo civilization, more impressive in their way than any military victory. Through every transformation, every challenge, every adaptation forced by changing circumstances, the Gerudo remained true to the core principles that had defined them from the beginning. Their understanding of strength went beyond mere physical power to encompass the courage to face uncertainty, the wisdom to adapt without losing essential identity, the loyalty to support one another through whatever trials might come. In their desert kingdom, where survival itself was an act of defiance against a hostile environment, they had learned that the greatest victories were not won through conquest, but through the simple determination to endure, to thrive, and to build something beautiful in the face of every obstacle the world could devise. The sisterhood that bound them together transcended mere kinship to become a spiritual force that could overcome any challenge, whether it came in the form of corrupted technology, twilight invasions, or the simple passage of time that changed everything, while leaving the essential truths untouched. In their fierce pride, their unshakable loyalty, their capacity for both tenderness and strength, the Gerudo embodied the paradox that defined all truly great civilizations, the ability to remain eternally themselves while constantly becoming something new. A mirror world where familiar faces live different lives, where the same souls wear different stories, like masks at an eternal carnival, where time itself has become trapped in an endless loop of 3 days that repeat with the mechanical precision of a clockwork universe gone mad. Termina exists as both sanctuary and prison, a realm where the deepest fears and hopes of parallel lives play out against the backdrop of impending doom that hangs overhead like a second moon, cold and terrible and inexorably approaching. The kingdom, if kingdom it can be called, centers around Clocktown, a settlement whose very name speaks to the obsession with time that defines every aspect of existence here. The great clock tower that dominates the town's heart serves as both timekeeper and temple, its mechanical rhythms marking the passage of hours that will always reset, days that will always return, moments that achieve a kind of immortality through endless repetition. The residents who call this place home have learned to live with the weight of temporal imprisonment, though few of them understand the true nature of their condition. Within the town's protective walls, life continues with a strange mixture of normalcy and underlying anxiety that colors every interaction. The carnival atmosphere that pervades the streets speaks to a desperate attempt to maintain joy in the face of overwhelming dread. Merchants hawk their wares, as if tomorrow will always come. Children play games that they will play again in exactly the same way once the cycle resets, while adults conduct their business with the careful precision of actors who have rehearsed their lines 10,000 times, but still fear forgetting their cues. The psychological toll of this existence reveals itself in the subtle tensions that run beneath the surface of every conversation. Some residents deny the approaching catastrophe with the fierce determination of those who refuse to accept the unacceptable, insisting that the moon overhead is merely an optical illusion or a hoax perpetrated by troublemakers seeking to spread panic. Others acknowledge the threat but respond with fatalistic resignation, carrying out their daily routines with the mechanical precision of people who have given up hope but continue moving because stillness would mean confronting the full horror of their situation. Yet, perhaps most heartbreaking are those who have begun to remember fragments of previous cycles, experiencing the temporal loops as a series of recurring nightmares from which they cannot wake. These unfortunate souls carry the burden of partial awareness, knowing that something terrible is about to happen, while being powerless to prevent it or even to convince others of the reality they perceive. Their growing madness serves as a warning of what total knowledge of their condition might cost. The carnival of time that gives meaning to the town's existence represents both celebration and memorial, a festival that honors the cycles of planting and harvest while serving as humanity's final party before an ending that will be neither final nor truly an ending. The preparations for this event consume the energy and attention of the entire community, providing a focus that keeps minds occupied with details too small to trigger the despair that lurks just beyond the edges of conscious thought. The swamplands that stretch beyond the town's southern gates tell their own story of a world caught between states of being. Woodfall's fetid waters and twisted trees create a landscape that seems designed by fever dreams, where the very air carries the weight of things that should not be. The Deku people who make their home in these hostile marshes have built a civilization that thrives in conditions that would be lethal to most other forms of life, their palace rising from the swamp like a monument to adaptation and determination. The Deku King's Court operates with the formal protocols befitting an ancient monarchy, though the subjects of his rule are creatures who blur the line between plant and animal, between individual consciousness and collective organism. Their trials and ceremonies speak to a culture that has found meaning in transformation itself, embracing the fluidity of identity that characterizes their swamp homeland, while maintaining the social structures that bind their community together. The temple that lies hidden within Woodfall's depths serves as both dungeon and shrine, its chambers filled with puzzles that test understanding of growth and decay, life and death, the endless cycles that govern all existence. The jungle warrior Odolwa, who guards its heart, embodies the primal forces that shaped this realm, his masked visage speaking to the power of anonymity, the strength that comes from surrendering individual identity to become something larger and more terrible than any single being could achieve alone. Yet even this guardian of cycles and seasons exists in thrall to the greater pattern that holds all of Termina in its grip. His defeat brings only temporary respite, for in 3 days he will stand again in his temple, ready to dance his eternal battle against any who would challenge the established order of endless repetition. The victory that should mark progress becomes instead another entry in a ledger that will be erased and rewritten without end. The frozen peaks of Snowhead Mountain tell a different but equally tragic tale, where the natural order has been disrupted by forces that bring winter where spring should flourish. The Goron village that huddles in the mountain's shadow has learned to endure, see conditions that violate every law of seasonal progression, their lives shaped by cold that should not exist and snow that falls without regard for calendar or climate. The tragedy of Darmani III resonates through these icy halls like an unfinished song, the tale of a hero who gave everything to save his people, yet failed to prevent the catastrophe that claimed his life. His spirit, unable to find rest while his people suffer, wanders the mountain paths seeking redemption that can only come through the actions of another. The Goron lullaby that soothes the tribal elder's crying child carries within its melody the memory of better times, when the mountain knew the warmth of proper seasons and the rhythm of natural change. The temple that crowns Snowhead's Peak houses mysteries wrapped in ice and shadow, its chambers echoing with the sound of mechanical wheels that grind through their eternal rotations without ever producing the change they seem designed to create. The guardian that awaits within has become something more machine than living creature, its form adapted to serve functions that transcend its original nature while losing something essential in the process. The coastal regions where the Great Bay spreads its waters toward distant horizons present yet another variation on the theme of disruption and adaptation. Here, the Zora have created a civilization that celebrates artistry and performance, their concerts and competitions providing beauty that stands in sharp contrast to the growing darkness that threatens their world. The death of Mikau, their beloved guitarist, creates a wound in their community that goes beyond the loss of a single talented individual to represent the silencing of joy itself. The pirates who have made the bay their domain operate with a code of honor that distinguishes them from mere criminals, their raids and battles governed by principles that speak to a nobility of purpose that transcends simple greed or violence. The fortress they have claimed as their stronghold rises from the waves like a monument to freedom, maintained through strength, its walls protecting not just treasure and territory, but the independence that allows them to live, according to their own rules rather than those imposed by others. The temple that lies beneath the bay's surface serves as a factory of sorts, its chambers filled with mechanisms that speak to a level of technological sophistication that exceeds anything found in the more familiar realms of Hyrule. The precision of its construction, the complexity of its systems, the integration of mechanical and organic elements all suggest a civilization that achieved heights of knowledge and capability that have since been lost to the world above. Yet perhaps the most haunting region of all is Ikana Valley, where death itself has become confused about its proper role and function. The ancient castle that dominates this cursed landscape serves as both tomb and throne room, its halls populated by the undead remnants of a civilization that refuse to accept the finality of its own ending. The king who holds court here rules over subjects who cannot die because they have never truly learned to live, their existence trapped in the same state of suspension that characterizes the entire realm. The mysteries that surround the fall of Ikana speak to conflicts that go beyond simple warfare to encompass the fundamental questions of what it means to exist, to have purpose, to accept the necessity of endings as well as beginnings. The soldiers who continue their patrols through empty corridors, the musicians who play melodies for audiences that no longer draw breath, the guardians who protect treasures that have lost all meaning, all serve as reminders that some forms of persistence are indistinguishable from damnation. The stone tower that rises from the valley's heart presents the ultimate paradox of Termina's existence. Built to reach toward heaven, it serves instead as a gateway to inversion, a structure that can be turned upside down to reveal hidden chambers and alternate passages. The symbolism is inescapable. In a world where time moves backward as often as forward, where death leads to continuation rather than conclusion, where familiar faces mask alien purposes, the very act of seeking transcendence becomes a journey deeper into confusion and contradiction. The music box house where Pamela tends her infected father serves as perhaps the most poignant example of how love persists even in circumstances that should make it impossible. The melody that keeps the cursed creatures at bay represents more than just a practical defense. It embodies the power of devotion to create islands of sanity and beauty in oceans of madness and despair. The father who dances to rhythms he cannot hear, driven by infection that should have destroyed his humanity, moves instead to the beat of his daughter's heart, the only music that still has the power to reach whatever remains of his soul. The ranch that lies hidden in the valley's depths tells its own story of mysteries that transcend the boundary between possible and impossible. The alien creatures that arrive each night to steal cattle represent fears that go beyond simple rustling to encompass the terror of being taken by forces so alien that their purposes cannot even be imagined. The young woman who stands guard against these otherworldly thieves embodies the courage required to face threats that exist outside the normal categories of danger and safety. The 3-day cycle that governs all existence in Termina creates a rhythm that becomes both comfort and torment for those trapped within its influence. Each reset offers the promise of new possibilities while delivering the reality of identical repetition, every choice leading to consequences that will be erased before they can achieve lasting significance. The few who retain memories across cycles bear the burden of knowledge that makes them witnesses to an eternal tragedy that plays out with the precision of a music box whose spring will never wind down. The masks that hold such power in this realm serve as more than mere magical artifacts. They represent the malleability of identity itself in a world where the same souls can wear different faces, different stories, different destinies, depending on which timeline happens to be currently active. The transformation that comes with donning these masks speaks to the fluid nature of self in a reality where nothing is truly permanent except the patterns that repeat without variation or growth. The moon that hangs overhead like a judge pronouncing sentence embodies the ultimate paradox of Termina's existence. Its face, carved with features that express rage and sorrow in equal measure, serves as both threat and symbol, both literal danger and metaphorical representation of the despair that defines this parallel world. The children who play beneath its shadow in the strange realm hidden within its substance speak to the innocence that persists even in the face of cosmic horror, their games and questions revealing truths that adults have forgotten in their desperate attempts to maintain sanity. The final confrontation that determines the fate of this suspended world takes place not in a grand throne room or on a battlefield, but in a grassy field that exists outside the normal boundaries of time and space. Here, where the artificial constraints of the 3-day cycle cannot reach, the true nature of the conflict is revealed. Not a battle between good and evil, but a struggle between the desire for change and the fear of transformation, between the need for growth and the comfort of familiar patterns, between the courage required to face an uncertain future and the safety found in endless repetition of a known past. The mask that lies at the heart of this conflict represents the accumulated weight of all the sorrow and rage that sentient beings can experience, the crystallized essence of suffering given form and purpose and terrible power. Its defeat requires not strength of arms, but understanding of the pain that created it, recognition that evil often begins as a response to unbearable loss and grows into something monstrous only when that loss is allowed to consume everything else that gives life meaning. The restoration of normal time to Termina comes not as conquest, but as healing, not as victory, but as the gentle return of natural rhythms that allow for true change, real growth, genuine progress toward futures that cannot be predicted or controlled. The dawn that finally breaks over Clocktown is not just the ending of an artificial night, but the beginning of possibility itself, the return of hope to a world that had forgotten what it meant to look forward rather than merely around. In the end, Termina serves as both mirror and warning, reflecting the familiar while revealing the alien, showing what happens when the patterns of existence become trapped in loops that preserve form while destroying essence. Its salvation comes through the recognition that some things must be allowed to change, that growth requires the acceptance of uncertainty, that the courage to face tomorrow is perhaps the most heroic act any being can perform. The parallel world fades back into mystery, its lessons learned, and its people freed to write new stories, in the endless book of possibilities that opens whenever beings choose hope over fear, change over stagnation, the unknown future over the familiar prison of unchanging past. In a realm of eternal dusk, a people learn to thrive in exile, transforming banishment into a different kind of home, punishment into the foundation for a civilization unlike any other in the known worlds. The Twilight Realm exists in a state of perpetual between, neither full darkness nor true light, but something that partakes of both while belonging entirely to neither. Here, in this dimension of shadow and blue flame, the Twilight have built their palace and their culture around. The understanding that beauty can be found in the spaces between absolutes, that power flows not from conquest, but from acceptance of what cannot be changed. The palace of Twilight rises from the shadow plains like a dream given architectural form, its spires and bridges defying the conventional logic of construction while embodying principles of design that speak to minds shaped by different physical laws. The structures seem to float rather than stand, connected by spans of crystallized twilight that pulse with the same ethereal energy that flows through every aspect of Twilight technology. The blue radiance that illuminates these chambers is not mere decoration, but the visible manifestation of power itself, the raw force that sustains both the palace and the civilization it protects. The history that led to this realm's creation begins with a tale of ancient ambition and divine justice that echoes across the ages like a warning carved in stone. In the earliest days of recorded time, when the sacred realm was still accessible to mortal hands, and the Triforce waited for those bold enough to claim it, a group of powerful sorcerers arose among the peoples of the surface world. These interlopers, as history would remember them, possessed magical abilities that rivaled those of the sages themselves, knowledge that allowed them to pierce the veils between dimensions and walk paths that others could only dream of traversing. Their crime was born not of malice, but of a hunger for transcendence that consumed all other considerations. The Triforce, that ultimate symbol of divine power, called to them with a voice that drowned out wisdom, conscience, and the warnings of those who understood that some gifts were too dangerous for mortal hands to hold. The golden triangles promised everything that ambitious souls could desire: absolute power, unlimited knowledge, the ability to reshape reality according to their will rather than accepting the limitations that the gods had placed upon mortal existence. The attempt to claim the Triforce was both magnificent and terrible, a display of magical coordination and sheer audacity that had never been equaled before or since. The interlopers worked together with a precision that spoke to years of preparation, their combined will focused on a single moment when the barriers protecting the sacred realm would be at their weakest. For a brief, shining instant, it seemed as though they might succeed, that mortal determination could indeed overcome divine prohibition through nothing more than the refusal to accept defeat. But the gods of the Golden Land were not powerless to protect what they had created. The light spirits, guardians of the sacred power that flowed through all existence, rose to defend the Triforce from those who would claim it through force rather than worthiness. The battle that followed was fought not on any physical battlefield, but in the spaces between realities, where will confronted will and the very foundations of existence trembled under the strain of conflicting absolutes. The defeat of the interlopers was both punishment and mercy, exile that preserved their lives while ensuring they could never again threaten the balance of the worlds. The dimension to which they were banished was crafted specifically to contain their power, while allowing them the possibility of redemption through the slow work of building something worthy from the ashes of their ambition. The Twilight Realm became their prison, their purgatory, and ultimately their unexpected salvation. The transformation that overcame the exiled sorcerers was gradual but profound, their bodies and minds adapting to the unique conditions of their new home, while their souls underwent changes that went deeper than mere physical evolution. Over generations that stretched into millennia, they became the Twili, beings of shadow and twilight, who retained the magical gifts that had once made them dangerous, while gaining the wisdom that might have prevented their original transgression. The culture that emerged in this realm of eternal dusk was marked by a sophistication that surpassed even their ancestors' achievements. The Twili learned to harness the twilight energy that permeated their dimension, weaving it into technologies that blurred the line between magic and science. Their architecture defied gravity through understanding rather than brute force. Their art captured emotions that had no names in any surface language. Their governance was based on principles of harmony that their exile had taught them to value above all else. The palace that served as the heart of their civilization was both governmental center and spiritual focus, its chambers designed to channel the flow of twilight energy in patterns that promoted peace and contemplation. The throne room, where their rulers held court, was a masterpiece of ethereal beauty, its walls seeming to breathe with inner light, while the floor reflected images of the stars that shone in dimensions beyond counting. Here, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of their people, the Twilight monarchs made decisions that affected not just their own realm, but the delicate balance between all the worlds. Midna, the true princess of Twilight, embodied everything noble about her people's transformation from ambitious exiles to wise guardians of shadow. Her small form, marked by the distinctive orange hair that identified her royal bloodline, moved through the palace corridors with a grace that spoke to centuries of breeding and training in the arts of leadership. Yet it was her mind, rather than her heritage, that truly qualified her for rule, an intellect sharp enough to cut through the most complex problems, while retaining the compassion necessary to understand the needs of those who looked to her for guidance. The crisis that shattered this carefully maintained civilization came from an unexpected source, not from external invasion, but from the arrival of a figure whose very presence upset the balance that had taken generations to achieve. Ganondorf, the king of evil, had been banished to the Twilight realm by sages who thought to protect their own world by disposing of a threat they could not destroy. They failed to consider what such a powerful, malevolent force might do to a dimension whose inhabitants had spent millennia learning to live in harmony. The corruption that Ganondorf brought to the Twilight realm was not the crude violence that marked his actions in the world of light, but something far more insidious, a poison that worked through promise and seduction rather than threat and coercion. He understood instinctively how to appeal to the buried ambitions that still lurked in Twilight hearts, the memories of power that their ancestors had once possessed and might possess again if they were willing to embrace the darkness that he offered. Zant, the usurper who claimed Midna's throne through Ganondorf's backing, represented the tragic potential for corruption that existed even in hearts that had been shaped by exile and wisdom. His transformation from loyal courtier to megalomaniacal tyrant demonstrated how quickly the lessons of centuries could be forgotten when presented with the illusion of unlimited power. The mask he wore was both literal disguise and metaphorical representation of the way evil hides its true nature behind facades of righteousness and necessity. The reign of terror that Zant imposed upon the Twilight realm violated every principle that had guided Twilight civilization since its foundation. The souls, those crystalline repositories of Twilight energy that had served as both power sources and spiritual focuses for the palace, were corrupted and hidden away, plunging the realm into a darkness that was qualitatively different from the gentle twilight that had always been their natural element. The transformation that overcame the Twilight people themselves was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Zant's rule. Their elegant forms twisted into shapes that reflected his own madness, while their minds were clouded with confusion and despair. Midna's reduction from regal princess to imp-like creature was both personal tragedy and symbol of her realm's broader degradation. The curse that stole her true form also robbed her of much of her magical power, forcing her to rely on wit and determination rather than the awesome abilities that were her birthright. Yet even in this diminished state, she retained the essential nobility that marked true royalty, not the external trappings of crown and ceremony, but the inner strength that enabled her to continue fighting for her people, even when victory seemed impossible. The alliance between Midna and Link, the hero chosen by the gods of light, represented something unprecedented in the relationship between the worlds. Cooperation based on mutual respect rather than domination. Understanding that recognized the validity of different ways of being without demanding conformity to a single standard. Their partnership demonstrated that the barriers between light and shadow were not absolute, that beings from different realms could work together when united by common purpose and genuine friendship. The journey to reclaim the Twilight Realm required not just the defeat of Zant, but the restoration of the spiritual balance that his rule had destroyed. The recovery of the souls was more than a tactical objective. It was a symbolic act of healing that brought light back to places where darkness had reigned unchallenged. The crystalline artifacts pulsed with renewed energy as they were returned to their proper places, their radiance gradually pushing back the unnatural shadows that had infected every corner of the palace. The confrontation with Zant himself revealed the full extent of his madness and the pathetic nature of the power he had claimed through Ganondorf's influence. Without the Dark Lord's backing, the usurper proved to be nothing more than a broken soul whose ambitions had far exceeded his actual capabilities. His defeat came not through epic battle, but through the simple revelation of his own inadequacy, his inflated sense of importance collapsing like a balloon pricked by reality's sharp edge. The restoration of Midna to her true form marked more than just personal victory. It represented the triumph of authentic identity over imposed corruption, the reassertion of principles that had seemed lost but had merely been hidden beneath layers of deception and despair. The princess who emerged from the curse was both the same being who had been transformed and someone subtly different, marked by experiences that had tested her understanding of power, responsibility, and the true meaning of leadership. The palace that Midna reclaimed was physically unchanged, but spiritually renewed, its chambers once again flowing with the blue energy that had always been the Twilight's greatest achievement. The technology that had been corrupted during Zant's reign was gradually restored to its original function, while the art and architecture that had been defaced were repaired with loving attention to detail. Yet perhaps the most important restoration was that of the relationships between the Twilight people themselves, the bonds of trust and mutual support that had been strained by years of fear and suspicion. The decision to destroy the Mirror of Twilight at the story's end represented perhaps the most difficult choice that Midna ever made as ruler of her people. The mirror was not just a means of travel between dimensions, but a symbol of connection, a bridge that had allowed the Twilight Realm to maintain some contact with the worlds beyond its borders. Its destruction ensured that her people would be safe from future invasions, but also condemned them to an isolation that would be both protection and limitation. The farewell that preceded this ultimate sacrifice carried the weight of friendships that had transcended the boundaries between worlds, relationships that had proven that understanding could exist between beings whose natures seemed fundamentally incompatible. The tear that Midna shed as she prepared to sever the connection forever was perhaps the most human emotion ever displayed by a creature of twilight, a sign that some feelings exist in all dimensions and touch all hearts that are open to their influence. The aftermath of these events left the Twilight Realm forever changed, its people free to continue their evolution without interference from external forces, but also cut off from the possibility of broader connections that might have enriched their civilization. The palace continued to float in its dimension of eternal dusk, its spires reaching toward stars that no longer reflected the light of any other world, while its inhabitants pursued their studies and arts in a solitude that was both chosen and imposed. The legacy of Midna's reign extended beyond the immediate restoration of her realm to encompass a broader understanding of what leadership could mean in a universe where different forms of existence were equally valid. Her willingness to sacrifice personal happiness for her people's welfare, her ability to find strength in apparent weakness, her capacity to transform exile into opportunity, all became part of the wisdom that guided Twilight civilization as it moved forward into an uncertain but self-determined future. The twilight that gave the realm its name continued to flow through every aspect of Twilight existence, no longer as a reminder of banishment, but as a celebration of the unique perspective that came from living between absolutes. In the soft blue glow of their palace chambers, in the gentle shadows that played across their floating gardens, in the quiet rhythms of lives lived according to principles learned through hardship and refined through wisdom, the Twilight had created something that surpassed even their ancestors' dreams. Not power over others, but harmony within themselves. Not dominion over reality, but acceptance of their place in the grand pattern that connected all things across all dimensions. The Twilight Realm stands eternal in its chosen isolation, a reminder that some of the most beautiful civilizations arise not from conquest, but from adaptation, not from the imposition of will upon reality, but from the patient work of building something worthy within the constraints that existence provides. In their palace of floating stone and crystallized light, the Twilight continue their ancient journey from ambition to wisdom, from exile to acceptance, from the hunger for power to the satisfaction of purpose fulfilled. And so we've walked together through the sacred places of Hyrule, from the clouds of Skyloft to the shadows of the Twilight Realm. Each location tells the same eternal story of people finding ways to endure, to hope, to build something beautiful, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. Whether it's the Gorons carving memorials to their heroes, the Zora preserving the memory of their princess in stone, or the simple folk of Clocktown dancing despite the moon's approach, these places remind us that home is not just where we live, but where we choose to care for each other. The castles may fall and rise again, the forests may sleep and wake, the very geography may shift and change, but the stories endure. They live in the stones and streams, in the songs and silence, in every corner where someone once chose love over fear, hope over despair. These are the hidden stories behind Zelda's most iconic places. Not just tales of heroes and princesses, but of ordinary people making extraordinary choices to build something lasting. Through floating islands that remember the goddess's love, through temple chambers where time bends to serve destiny's needs, through desert fortresses where strength grows from sisterhood, we've discovered that the true magic of these legendary places lies not in their supernatural properties, but in their capacity to inspire the best in those who seek their shelter. The great Deku Tree's wisdom, Death Mountain's brotherhood, Zora's domain's flowing grace, Each offers a different lesson about what it means to create home in a world that often seems hostile to such dreams. The Twilight Realm's exile became sanctuary. Termina's repetition taught the value of change. The Lost Woods showed that protection sometimes means letting go. Every location we've visited has faced destruction, corruption, or abandonment, yet each has found renewal through the simple persistence of those who refuse to let beauty die. In their recovery, in their transformation, in their quiet endurance through ages of trial, these places mirror our own capacity for resilience. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, let these peaceful places cradle your dreams. Let the eternal rhythms of these sacred spaces, the gentle breathing of the great Deku tree, the soft lapping of Zora's domain, the warm glow of Goron forges, carry you into rest. The stories we've shared flow like water between worlds, connecting every heart that has ever sought meaning in the spaces where imagination meets memory. In your dreams, you might find yourself walking these paths again, discovering that the most important journeys are not those that take us to distant places, but those that help us understand what we've carried with us all along. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere beyond the veil of waking consciousness, these places wait for your return, repositories of the deepest truths about courage, wisdom, and the power that flows from choosing to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to hope rather than despair. In these legendary lands where heroes are made and legends are born, the greatest adventure is always the one that leads us home to ourselves.